Welcome everyone to this webinar on FDA's adoption of the GDP guidelines. While we are waiting for the last people to join in the room, you're more than welcome to use the chat and tell us where you're listening from. That would be great. Thank you very much. And we'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. Hello everyone again. So yeah, we'll be starting in just a few minutes. So just to get us all started and be on the same page, we have a small poll for you. So we would really love to hear if you've already adapted all or some of the GDP guidelines. So there will be a small questionnaire on screen where we will be waiting for the last participants to join in just a minute or two. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on FDA's adoption of the GDP guidelines. First of all, we had a small poll here, and I'll just put the results here on screen. We still have some people participating in here, but it seems like a lot of you have already adapted some or the entirety of the GDP guidelines. So I hope that will make for some great discussions today.
Definitely.
So we have an exciting program for you today. But first of all, let's get started. So first of all, introduction: who are we, and why are we talking today? So with me here, I have Mads, who's our senior product specialist at UPRI. He works tirelessly every day to help our customers find the right solutions, both in the US and Europe and most other parts of the world as well. It's great to see that there's so many people joining in from a lot of different places around the world. That's also very closely related to our outreach. We have customers from all around the world. So my name is Jacob, and I'm the head of quality here at UPRI. And for the last decade, I've been working with the GXP industries in terms of quality systems, managing our internal quality systems, as well as our calibration, helping our customers with compliance, mostly related to storage compliance, which is what UPRI is working with as well. I'll just get this off the screen. So yeah, we have a small presentation today, and I would like us to start with saying that if you have any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to bring them on, and we'll try to take it along the way and answer any questions. But other than that, we have our Frederikke on the chat as well, trying to help you out if there are any specific questions that can be answered along the way. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm looking very much forward to this discussion today, Jacob. But just to kick it off a bit here and give everybody an introduction to who we in UPRI actually are and what we're doing. Then obviously, like, we are a company which is working around like everything that we call temperature compliance. So it's a lot of different things that we try to combine into one solution and be one supplier for it as well. So on the screen, you're seeing the different elements, like it can be validation, mapping, monitoring, and calibration. So essentially trying to bridge these different elements together and have one solution for it. We work very much with trying to make it a bit more digital and a bit more efficient to work around. So that's what we do in our normal day, so to speak.
Absolutely. But let's head on right to the agenda. What are we actually going to talk to today? So following the COVID pandemic, there's been an increase in FDA's enforcement on a lot of the GDP rule sets, and we've gotten a lot of questions with how should we handle FDA inspections regard to good distribution practices. And we've set together, well, first of all, we should say that we get a lot of different insights from our customers. We get a lot of information, questions, feedback from when auditors have been by. So we'll try today to gather a lot of that information into a presentation, some of our views. But it's, as we also discussed, it's very important for us to get your inputs as well. What do you see out there? It's something that's a very hot topic with companies being inspected by the FDA. Looking towards harmonization with the GDP guidelines. So we'll take a brief look today at what are those guidelines, both in terms of the FDA and the different guidelines under and EMA, and looking at good distribution practices. In our daily work, we work both with GDP and GMP and GLAP and so forth. But today we'll take a closer look at good distribution practice and specifically within storage compliance. That's really our field of knowledge. Then we'll take a look at some of the key elements to maintaining storage compliance within a sort of a framework of GDP, European GDP, mainly within premises and equipment. That's one of the key elements, and within monitoring and alarming. And then at the end, we have a Q&A session. But again, please don't hesitate to bring up. These discussions become a lot more interesting if anyone chips in and tries to come with some great questions. Those are often more well thought than the ideas we had when we plan these webinars. But without further ado, let's just jump into it. So first of all, where in the guidelines are there mentioned any sort of requirements for distribution of pharmaceuticals? So if we start out with the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, first of all, it's a slightly, I think that's one point to keep in mind, that's slightly different from the FDA from EMA, where FDA do all of the inspections as one organization, whereas in the European Union, with EMA, it's up to the individual states to perform these inspections. And it does come with some variance in terms of how regulations are enforced. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that dependent on whether you're being inspected by the FDA or one of the EMA local authorities, the level and the expectations might vary a bit. So that's sometimes a little bit hard for us sometimes to sort of convey that message, that you can't expect the auditors to be on the same level on every single point. But there are some general guidelines. So starting with the FDA, basically there are two major parts where distribution is mentioned and storage compliance. 21 CFR Part 205 with wholesale drug distribution has some guidance, some regulations, and 21 CFR Part 211. I should always keep on saying 21 CFR Part 11, but this is a very hot topic as well. There are other parts as well with the CGMP. The same, it's a little bit easier in my perspective with EMA, because you have the GDP guideline, which is global for all of the EMA membership countries. So you have the GDP guidelines. It's a very brief document. It's very well written. It's quite easy to read. I think it's about 11, 12 pages or so. Goes through all the different adherence, or all the different topics you need to adhere to in terms of distribution. But there are also some organizations which work towards harmonizing these standards across the globe. Of the most importance are ICH, International Council for Harmonization, and they have specifically one called Q7, which goes into detail as to how should you implement these expectations that auditors and authorities will have in terms of when you're distributing pharmaceuticals. I think another one, which is not as often mentioned, but has some very good guidance, is the PKS. So they try to work towards mutual recognition of inspection between member states. and they have some really great standards and guidelines in how should you be expected to be inspected when either applying for or maintaining your distribution certification. So those are some of the standards that we'll discuss today, and we'll bring up some examples. But that's also a really nice place to start. Those are all for free. It's possible to go in and have a look at them. I don't know what your experience as well in terms of which standards and guidelines are some of our customers at least lean towards, or
I think it's very different what we hear, because obviously it also depends on the company we work with. Some of them have plants in Europe. Some of them have plants in the US as well.
Yeah.
So sometimes like having these different organs, the ICH and so forth, makes it a bit easier for us to kind of guide them towards what is actually the direction that they need to take, because there can be a bit of a difference, as you mentioned, in terms of what are we doing in EMA and what are we doing at the FDA. But yeah, just having these organization makes it a bit easier to kind of figure out a direction that you need to go into.
Absolutely. And I would also, I think we can both agree that having a look at the GDP guidelines from EMA, and then at least browsing through both PGS and ICH Q7, you would have a really good foundation of how to do storage compliance. It will be hard for an auditor at least to sort of try to create any non-conformities if you're compliant to those regulations. But moving forward, as one of the most important part, I mentioned before, the GDP guidelines. The main sections within the GDP guidelines has to do with quality management. You need to ensure that you enforce quality management, that you have a quality management system in order with your processes. I think this comes without saying for most of these standards. You need to ensure that you have your personnel under control, training, instructions, and so forth. Premises and equipment, which we'll take a closer look today. Documentation, which kind of level of documentation is expected when auditors come by. Your operations, you need to have control over how your operations are, both in storage and transportation. There's a whole section on complaints, returns, falsified medicinal products, and so forth. I won't go into much detail with that. Outsourced activities, that's without going into too much details, that's one of the places we see the FDA really starting to enforce controls, like how much of these activities within distribution chain do you have under control, and do you have control of those outsourced activities, and the same guidelines and rule sets should be applied to outsourced activities. That's one thing we're really starting to see them being enforced, especially for GMP companies.
Yeah, I think it's just the whole complexity also gets a bit more complex in general looking at when you start to have a rule set that you need to imply yourself, but then you start taking outside companies in as well, and then obviously need to follow the same rule set. So yeah, it's definitely a hot topic.
Absolutely. And I think one of the key topics that we're also seeing, at least that's my own theory, is that a lot of the enforcement of GDP, especially from the FDA, actually starts from FDA having increased focus on GMP companies and their companies outsourcing of distribution. So in that sense, it's related somehow. But that's why it's a very interesting topic for today. Self-inspections, again, internal audits, so forth, in inspecting transportation, provisioning for brokers, and then final provisions. We won't go into much details with those. So today, we're going to focus on this premises and equipment, because that's the most important. That's where we have something to say. And that's also where we help our customers in terms of staying compliant and obtaining certifications as well. So here at Europe, we like to use this circle of storage compliance, which deals with the whole procurement of equipment, validation, and then ongoing monitoring, calibration, revalidations, reviews and tendencies, and audits. So what does the GDP guideline and PGS have to say about these different topics? So in terms of continuous monitoring and calibration, all guidelines are very specific on the fact that you need to have temperature monitoring equipment and all relative humidity monitoring equipment. They are also very clear on the fact that it needs the placements of these sensors needs to be the results of a mapping and we'll get into that topic in a short while. This webinar today won't be as much about mapping as some of our others. We have some great webinars on mappings, which you can see on demand. There's also the requirements that sensors are to be calibrated, and there's a small variance in the different guidelines in terms of how often these sensors should be calibrated. GDP guidelines actually have a statement that if it's used for transportation, it should be yearly. But in general, the bare minimum requirements is that equipment is calibrated and that it's calibrated at defined intervals. And what do you mean by defined intervals? It's basically a risk assessment along the way, but also we do see an increasing expectation that this is done yearly. I assume that's also what we talk about.
It's very typically what we see in the market, and also kind of what we advise our customers to do. Is doing an annual, it's kind of like an industry standard. It's almost become, although it's not necessarily written any specific place. But no, there's a lot of great things to discuss around calibration. There's also places in the same GDP or GDP guidelines in terms of also how you're actually like handling the whole calibration, which is also an interesting thing too, that it doesn't, like, it should be done in a way that it doesn't interfere with the integrity of the products. Like, how are you actually going to handle like doing the calibration, which is, it's an interesting thing to just as a company that you need to consider at least before, you know, buying a monitoring system. Just give it some thoughts in terms of how we're going to calibrate this. Is also an interesting thing that we need to look into and discuss.
And absolutely, and we'll be discussing these points in greater detail in just a while. This is just to give you guys a brief baseline for what the expectations are. One thing that's quite interesting actually regarding the continuous monitoring is that one point where the standards and guidelines differ a bit is actually in their written expectations for alarm systems. So some of these guidelines do, at least in writing, require alarm systems. So whenever you experience, for example, temperatures to be outside expected intervals, they require an alarm system to be set up. The GDP guidelines don't actually specifically require this, but we do see that auditors expect alarm systems to be set up. And in the modern systems that are available in the market today, there's very few of those that don't provide alarming capabilities. So it shouldn't be too much of a hassle, but
no, it's it's not, it's as you say yourself, like it's very typical for the modern day technology and systems today. I think the more interesting thing or topic to dive into is obviously what are you going to do when you get an alarm, like having procedures in place for that is obviously the conversations, or typically at least the conversations that we go into with the different companies, is just make sure you have some different processes in place. If there's an alarm coming at 1 in the morning on a Saturday, what are you going to do? What is the process? It's an important thing to keep under control.
And there was a bit of foreshadowing on things we're going to talk about, so that's great. Absolutely. So moving on again, don't hesitate to put some questions in the chat. We're keeping a keen eye on it here. So the second part in which the guidelines are very clear is on mappings. So a mapping, often the guidelines will refer to a temperature mapping, but in reality, auditors do expect to have a temperature mapping done as a bare minimum. And if you identify any risks due to high levels of relative humidity, then the mappings for relative humidity must be performed as well.
Is it also related to like product in itself? Like, how do you actually decide?
Exactly,
like one thing is obviously the environment that you're in, but how much is also related to like the product? Or
well, I think as always, these processes are related to products. I mean, so it's a great question, and we get it often. Do I need to perform relative humidity mappings? Well, it all comes down to the product, and some of the typical reasons or the rationales behind choosing relative humidity mappings is where we see cases of delamination of labels. Then it becomes a CGMP issue, because if you have labeling, you can have risks of either falsified medicine or difficulties in returning. You could also have disintegrity of packaging material, so cardboard boxes and such. But one thing we often see as well is that it needs to be based on a risk assessment. So in Denmark here, it's very rare that it gets very humid. we're a quite cold country in general and a quite dry country. But for companies or some of our customers, we see in countries where high relative humidity is more prevalent, definitely you need to perform relative humidity mapping. And also one thing to remember is that it's not a huge cost increase.
No.
So often auditors, we've seen customers getting asked, why didn't you just do it? It was very little extra cost, but that's a whole other discussion, I think. But
Yeah, definitely.
But another key element is that there needs to be an initial temperature mapping and also remappings or revalidations depending on usage. And there's several guidelines which outline this very specifically. But in general, all guidelines do expect and rule sets do expect to have a temperature mapping performed as an initial mapping and also during any larger changes that there are to the facility. And secondly, that these temperature mappings involve some level of risk assessments, both as a general topic to like risk assessment and risk-based approach in general, but also for mappings, it's becoming increasingly important to perform risk assessments in terms of what's the extent of your mapping. But we'll get into details with that. So there's already a question here. Is it required to repeat the temperature mapping after a certain interval or different seasons, rainy, summer, winter? And that's a great question. And we'll put that in the pocket because we'll deep dive into that. But thank you very much for the question. The third section here is premises and equipment. So as said before, there's different requirements for how to set up these alarm systems. Some of these guidelines do require alarm systems to be in place, but the key element in terms of alarms is actually not so much that alarms are present, that's bare minimum, but also that the storage conditions have been predefined. So that's one place where we see some customers get deviations, is that it's assumed that general alarm limits can be accepted without taking into consideration the specific products that are stored. What does that mean? That means that you have your typical temperature ranges, 2 to 8 degrees, 15 to 25, and so forth, but not having taken into account how close to those limits do we operate. If we operate in very cold climates, as an example, accepting an alarm level of 2.1 degrees is not appropriate, because the risk that you might succeed those alarm limits is not a finding per se, but it's something that it's a risk that should have been identified. And the second part is we often see is that alarms need to be regularly tested. So basically testing these alarms on a regular basis is also a requirement. And again, there's some more questions regarding temperature mapping, and we'll basically come to those in just a short while. But thank you very much for being engaging in the chat here.
Is there any, like in terms of the whole alarming aspect of it, and the testing part of it, and I know we're also going to dive a bit more into the whole like qualification of a system, but how do you go about the whole documentation part of that? Because obviously you can test an alarm system, but and nobody knows that I've done it, and I can say I've done it. So what is the again, like what is the bare minimum in terms of like how do you as a company kind of go about that?
That's a really good question, and if we're talking sort of the regulatory expectations, one thing that it's actually a really good question, because it also has to do with a lot of the companies that we see dealing with distribution of pharmaceuticals do not necessarily come from a background of pharmaceuticals or GMP. So in that sense, that it makes a lot of sense to be worried about or be concerned with the level of documentation that you would perform in other areas of your business and the level of documentation that is expected when dealing with pharmaceuticals. So first of all, I mean, the general saying is that if it's not documented, it never happened, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, so that's really a bare minimum. But I think actually basically the same with the expectations for qualifications. A lot has to do with setting up what are you expecting from this process or from this qualification. as stated in the GDP guideline, equipment and process should be respectively qualified and or validated. So a large part of that is setting up the requirements for, let's say, an alarm test. What do we expect to see? It's not enough just to say, I tested the alarm, I got an alarm.
Yeah.
No, you said, which kind of alarm did you mean to trigger? Was it a high alarm? Yes. Okay, so you expected to get a high alarm. Which people did you expect to get this alarm? At which part of the day did you expect to get this alarm? There's a lot of this setting up your expectations for what the outcome of the test is, where we're seeing companies who are not as used to working with pharmaceuticals fail and get warnings or at least non-conformities.
Yeah, I think it's a very a typical thing that we have a discussion about, at least, is obviously this, like, how do you document things? Because as you mentioned yourself, it's very much to a certain level about just making it a bit like bulletproof of just everything you think, just put it down on a piece of paper and have it documented. I think that's the typical saying that we also have when we talk to different companies about it, at least.
Absolutely. So there's a really good question here related to this, which is, do we need to have categorization of the alarms of the storage area? Please share your view to consider all the alarms for assessment. So, yeah, you do. You do need, let me put it another way. If you rely on different types of alarms to react in different ways, you need to categorize those alarms and test accordingly.
Yeah.
So, like with our system, I think most systems have these alarms, which are sort of pre-warning alarms. We call them gray zone alarms. Basically, you get an alarm when you're approaching out of spec. So if you've set up an internal process where you do not need to act, or you need to act after a certain amount of time on near non-conformant temperatures, for example, you need to test that out. That needs to work as well. And a lot of the feedback we're getting from customers is that the auditors are really interested in how do you handle what happens if an alarm happens. Yeah. Have you tested that? That's also part of the alarm testing. What we're seeing is, yes, sure, that technically you got the alarm, but did you do something?
Yeah, exactly.
Did you test your processes? It's. I often like to compare it pretty much to business continuity testing.
Yeah.
Like, do not only technically did you get the alarm, but do your processes start as well? I think, yeah, for the sake of time, we'll just continue a bit. There's some great questions. So, qualification. As I mentioned before, equipment and processes should be qualified and or validated. So, in general, the rule of thumb is that we qualify equipment and we validate processes. So that's back to what we just talked about. The equipment must be qualified as part of a process validation. So the equipment must work, it must send data, it must be calibrated and so forth. And that's before commencing. And that's another part where we see a lot of these retrospective validations being performed, and auditors are starting to, at least that's my impression, starting to not like that as much. And of course, and again, you need to have reports on this. You need to have documented that you've done these activities. So moving on here. So these are some of our ideas about what should you be concerned about. Where should your focus be if you want to be compliant to GDP and some of FDA's expectations. Again, in terms of premises and equipment, first of all, validation and qualification. A key element or a key model to validation is basically the V model. I think a lot of you have used this, but we see over and over again customers within the GDP segment failing to set up the requirements. The testing, we see a high level in general, but setting out the specific requirements. What are the user requirements? What are risks have been identified? And the design of buildings and processes, have that been qualified to be able to support those requirements that you set forth? I don't know if you have.
That's completely true. Yeah. And I think also that just to a certain level, like following the right order as well, in terms
Yeah.
of giving the thoughts and documenting the things before you kind of start implementing different elements is also something that we typically see. But I think also just in, like, now I know we're looking at like validation and qualification and around mappings and so forth, but obviously also the same thing goes for when you are implementing a monitoring system as well. It's the same thoughts that you need to go through in terms of what is the monitoring system supposed to be able to do, what is the required specifications for it, and obviously qualifying that those different elements of the system that you are expecting, that you are essentially relying upon on your day-to-day operation, that they're actually working and so forth. That's a lot of things to talk about on those elements.
Absolutely, and I think it also relates to the question that just came in here. If a system itself controls the temperature excursion by means of a dual compressor system, then does it also require to have an alarm? And that's actually a really good point to this specifically, because what we often see is that equipment that is relied on to minimize or mitigate some risks have not been qualified. Great examples we've seen where a secondary power backup system was installed in order to mitigate the risk that power might there might be a power outage, and in that sense the temperatures were right outside compliance limits. But because that secondary power system was not qualified and validated and subsequently tested, it could not be used to mitigate risk. And as you mentioned before, it's so important to set up your requirements for all of these, not only the monitoring system, not only performing the mapping, but also when you're installing your HVAC systems, cushioning doors, truck gateways, all those things. If you rely on them to mitigate some risk, you need to qualify them.
Yeah.
And in general, if they are part of a crucial process, you need to qualify them. There's another question here in terms of explaining the abbreviation GDP. I'm so sorry if we've not already done it, but it's a good distribution practice as a counterpart to good manufacturing practices and good laboratory practices and so forth. So moving on, the next part here is mappings. So when having, that's all the way down from smaller units, fridges, freezers that might be stored, walk-in rooms, temperature control rooms, up to entire warehouses, mapping is a requirement. Sorry. Yeah, there was some questions. I'm sorry that the V model is so small. It was more meant as a demonstration, but thank you very much. So again, mapping is required, and we do see this as part of the validation process. So that means, in other words, that what you're mapping and the expected results of a mapping should be based on your user requirement specification and your risk analysis. So mapping an area, let's say a warehouse, a very large warehouse, we're increasingly seeing that auditors are not satisfied just placing sensors where guidelines state them, where the rule of thumb is to state them, but that it should also follow a risk analysis. So for mapping specifically, that is near doors, windows, truck gates, personnel entrances, heating elements, truck lift chargers, so forth. This should be covered as well. And we're seeing an increased focus on the risk-based approach from mappings as well. There were some questions early on also in terms of the mapping interval. There was one who said that
with the seasonals and
so the first question regarding mappings was based on seasonal mappings. Again, that is a risk-based approach. So if well, I guess there are no places on Earth that don't experience any seasons, at least. But if there are significant seasonal changes, you need to assess if it has an impact during the coldest period and the hottest period. And I missed it now, but I saw someone who justified the period of the hottest season and the coldest season based on meteorological data. And that's also what we see. That's a perfectly fine justification for choosing when to perform a summer mapping and when to perform a winter mapping. But again, you need to perform mapping as part of your operational qualification and performance qualification. Whereas we typically say that an operational qualification is an empty mapping and a performance qualification is on a full mapping. Furthermore, the guidelines and rule sets are very strict on the fact that after major changes or on regular basis the facilities and equipment needs to be remapped. and it basically derived from both technically wise. I mean, systems do degrade over time, seals get leaky, changes happen, but also due to process changes. So if you start having a larger traffic of goods in and out of your warehouses or temperature control chambers, you need to ensure that the control system can still handle that. And also just on a regular, also after major changes to technical installations. So if you change out the HVAC system, you definitely need to do a remapping.
I think some of the questions that we also typically get is obviously when we're looking at GDP, because one thing is that we have the warehouse, but a lot of these companies also have trucks. Because obviously there's also a lot of different scenarios that you can do in a truck with the whole compartmentation that you can do. So that's also a big thing in terms of like how many of the different compartments that you can do with some of the walls you can set up. Like is there any specific rule of thumb to follow in terms of when you're doing it on a truck, for instance?
I think that's a very good question. I mean, we're receiving a very large amount of requests for mapping trucks, which we do at the moment, especially in the US. Mostly followed by requests from the FDA inspectors. So I think it's still an area that is about to settle in terms of expectations. But in general, there's the more in detail guideline from ISP on controlled temperature chamber mapping and monitoring, which is a great guideline. The general concept is you should test your worst case scenarios. So we see a lot of examples where you have dual compartment systems. So if you have some that are at freezing temperatures and you have some that are at ambient temperatures, you should basically try to map when is the largest risk that those two compartments might influence each other. And secondly, when is the largest risk to non-conformant temperatures? So that would be during midday in the summer, as an example. But it's a great question, and I think we're still all waiting for FDA to come with some more general guidance, or some of the organizations to bring some more specific guidance on how you should map trailers. But in general, we see a lot of trailer mappings.
Definitely.
So again, another great question related to mapping, which is, will you change your hot and cold spot with each seasonal change without mapping, only using historical data? No. I would, if you by historical data mean historical mapping data, then yes, you could change your cold and hot spots. But just looking at meteorological data, you cannot. You need data to have an idea of where to place sensors, and it's also one of the things we'll go into detail in just a short while. But in general, we get a lot of these questions as to which hotspot or which cold spot. And I think as a general rule of thumb, if you have one hotspot during summer and one hotspot during winter, and one cold spot during summer and one cold spot during winter, you need 4 loggers. So deciding on exactly when to move a logger from one hotspot to the other, I have yet to see an auditor really be happy about that solution. It might work somewhere that I'm not aware of, but in general, 4 loggers, especially if it's a large warehouse. I think for a smaller freezer, it's not normally seasonally influenced.
No. I mean, it obviously depends a lot on in terms of, as you say, like how much is it influenced? Like if you have a freezer which is inside a building which is controlled temperature, then it typically doesn't affect the temperature that much anyway.
Absolutely. I've yet to see one that's stored outside at least as well. Okay. So just moving on here, in terms of premises and equipment as well, you need to have procedures in place. And I'm not talking right now about the procedures for alarm handling. I'm basically talking about, do you have procedures for how to behave in your warehouse, as an example? Do you have procedures in place for controlled temperature chambers or fridges and freezers? How often can you open them? How fast did you need to close them again? These are some very basic requirements that we're really starting to see our customers being pursued by auditors. Having specific procedures in how to behave. Where do you store incoming goods? How fast do they need to be moved to long-term storage? And how do you ensure that doors and gates are not opened all the time or in unnecessarily long periods of time? For me, it's such an easy win, and you will impress your auditor by having your set of procedures in place. when you're on site.
Yeah, and it's definitely something as well you can test throughout when you're doing the mapping.
Yeah.
As well is testing those facilities, like products coming in and out, the doors opening. How does that affect the temperature, the fluctuation as well? So it's something that is, yeah, I should say, so an easy win.
Yeah,
to show a bit.
Okay, yeah. So I'll just take some of the questions along the way here. So, yeah, starting out in terms of monitoring and alarming, we'll be looking at data loggers, calibration, alarming, and procedures. And just starting out with the data loggers, you need data loggers.
You definitely do.
And I think when we did this years ago, we would always say, we would advise for choosing a wireless system. And I think today most systems are wireless or can at least be remotely accessed. The use of USB data loggers is outdated in my perspective, both because you can't get alarming. That's one thing. And also we see a very high degree of human error related to USB data loggers. They might not get started. They might run out of battery. They might run out of storage capacity, so that you cannot get the full picture, the full amount of data that you were looking for. So having an alarm system or having a data logger system in place that can do alarming, it's almost an expectation, would say. From
I would also say it also makes the day-to-day life a bit easier, I would say. Because then again, if you don't have a system which is alarming, then I think you also need to have some procedures in place saying, well, then you need to walk around to all the lockers a few times throughout the day and ensure that none of them is actually in alarm. So then again, it's just, it's easing up the life a bit more for the people actually working with the system, that they don't need to walk around, but just react on things if an alarm is coming.
Absolutely. So this next section is on calibrations, and the guidelines are also very strict on the fact that you need to have calibrations. In general, we'd normally like to say that there are two types of calibrations that are even to be considered. One is a traceable calibration, and the other one is an accredited calibration. Both of those types of calibrations, per definition, fulfill the requirements for the harmonization standards, also in the good distribution practice, because traceable stands for traceable to the international system of standards. But what then is the difference between a traceable calibration and an accredited calibration? So in theory, you could choose a calibration supplier that is traceable, that uses equipment that is traceable to the international system of standards through a series of calibrations of their reference equipment. But you would need, as a company, to go and audit and assess their calibration capabilities. So you need to ensure that the calibrations are actually performed as per good standards, which is basically the ISO 17025 standard. Around the world, the only or almost the only standard on calibration. And that's why a lot of companies choose an ISO 17025 accredited calibration. So that basically means that an independent third party has visited the company, like they do with us. You can see our small logo up in the middle, up in the top there. Our DANAC, that's Danish accreditation organ, which comes by and audits us once a year to ensure that our calibrations can be trusted when we perform accredited calibrations, just like you can trust all other accredited calibrations. In theory, it's not required to have an accredited calibration, but in reality, the hurdles related to inspecting your calibration supplier are really high compared to the relative cost.
Yeah.
Another key part of calibration is you should consider your calibration process. And you went through this in the beginning here.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just because there's a lot of different ways to obviously get your system calibrated. Are you going to do it on site? Are you shipping it out? Again, it's always the whole concept of saying, like, consider the process, like the procedures that you are actually going into. Are you going to take the locker out of the environment? Then you need to remove the product as well, unless you have a spare locker or similar that you can replace it with. So I think it's just important to at least kind of consider it before you go out buying a monitoring system or the data lockers for it. At least consider what are the possibilities of calibrating this system. Can you do it yourself internally? Do you need an external company for it? Like, what are the different options that you have available? And I think also the whole fact of considering like how are you actually getting like the calibration certificates. It's like the whole traceability aspect of things as well. I think it's always relating back like how can you actually make it a bit easier for yourself. Don't necessarily make it harder than it actually is to live up to the guidelines. So it's just to use your terminology, an easy win sometimes. Having an easy way of handling calibration, getting calibration certificates in a format that makes it easier for you as a company to actually store them and trace it back. So when you're actually being audited, you know where they are and you don't have them scrolling in an email or something.
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing a lot of easy wins that missed by just reviewing the calibration documentation that comes in from the supplier. Having a look at it is really a key part of it. And auditors do expect you to have some sort of knowledge about what you've purchased when you've chosen a calibration supplier, and that the calibrations are valid for the range you're using them in. And there's also a question here regarding how often wireless loggers should undergo calibration. And I think we mentioned it previously before as well, but in theory, there's very little specific guidance in the rule sets about how often, but we're seeing an industry standard being 1 year. And I think most of our customers in this industry, they choose yearly calibration, right?
Yeah, I think, I would say 90% choose a yearly calibration. I think we hear it from others sometimes, and I think it also comes back to obviously like a more technical aspect of it, like how long is a calibration valid. It can obviously, everything is about documentation for it. You have some saying that a valid calibration certificate is valid for 2 years or 3 years, which can be a bit, well, how can you say that?
Calibration certificates don't have expiry dates.
No.
I think that's one myth we can get off the table quite easily. When data loggers are calibrated, you know how much they've drifted, and how long time how much risk can you take in terms of the equipment drifting too much out of specifications before you calibrate it again. That's basically what you should take into account. So there was also another great question here in terms of how do you perform this calibration? I think that's a great question because there are different methods for this. A more typical method is taking your equipment down, having replacement equipment, setting that up, setting it for calibration, getting the data loggers back, replacing them again. I know we do it kind of differently in the sense that we send out freshly calibrated sensors. Those are switched and shortly after you're operational again. But there are different ways of doing this. And you should really consider this when choosing a system.
Yeah, I think, at least our approach is just, try to make it as efficient and kind of like do not interfere as much as we can with the operation. Because obviously you can also get an outside company coming on site, but it also means that they're running around. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something that you need to plan for, and you need to be aware of it at least. So just having a sensor that you can just swap out is obviously at least our approach for it. It's our opinion in terms of what is the easiest that we can do at least. So yeah, that's how we handle ours. Yeah,
absolutely. So just moving on to alarming. We've talked about it briefly before, but the general requirements is that we do inspectors expecting to have some sort of alarm system. I would turn the question around and say, how do you expect to be able to react to excursions if you don't have alarms on there? I mean, the only real alternative is to have some person on there 24 hours a day. And that would be an alarm system, like a meat and bones alarm system as well. But so having an alarm system in place, the important parts are you need to qualify that the settings for alarm systems are set correctly, and you need to qualify and test that your alarm settings work. So you need to have this in place. And that also goes very nicely with the next part, which is procedures. And we've already talked about this before as well, but we're seeing an increase in auditor focus on how to test procedures related both to storage compliance in general, but also to alarming. Who should do what when? Because as we often say, we like to joke with the fact that most alarms occur at Friday evening at 10 in the evening when everyone has gone home. So what happens there? Who reacts and what do they do? We've seen a lot of cases where the responsibility has been left to the employees handling the logistics. whose main responsibility it is to handle logistics. And it's not always that these people have been trained in what to do.
Yeah.
It's one thing is to get an alarm saying your temperature is rising, do something. But if you're standing there and you don't know what to do, well, you're not better off than not having received an alarm at all.
And I think this also relates to some of the other aspects of the GDP, like not necessarily the equipment or the premises and equipment, but there is also other aspects, like in terms of training. Like if you want to be like living up to the full package of the GDP rule set, then you also need to ensure and need to have documentation that all the different people who need to take part of the operation of the system is actually trained for it.
Absolutely, and also having, I think one thing we've yet to mention is that having procedures in place where you as a company yourself describe why did you choose this calibration, what do you need to go through and review when you receive calibration documentation, and what are your requirements for how the alarm system and the data logger should work in general. And that justification will be something that the auditors do go through and inspect along the way. So we've actually reached the end of our small presentations, but we have a lot of questions here that popped up through the chat that we didn't have a chance to answer. So we'll just go through some of them that we haven't seen so far. Yeah, again, so there's a lot of questions regarding seasonal mappings. I think we've already covered it slightly, but yeah, you do need to cover different seasonal changes. One thing I didn't mention so much in detail maybe is also you need to cover different processes. And what do I mean by that? It's saying if you have variations in your workload, as an example, that needs to be taken into account when designing your mapping strategy. You need to account for having periods of high activity and periods of low activity, just as well as you need to account for periods of high outside disturbances and low outside disturbances. So that's really one of the key things. And although the GDP and the FDA and ICH basically also, and PGS, ICH as well, don't mention it specifically. The PGS does, and the ISP guidelines do very specifically mention this as well. And one thing we haven't mentioned as well is there's the WHO guideline as well, do mention seasonal mappings as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most like typical questions that we get often is obviously because the GDP says you need to do a mapping, doesn't necessarily tell you how to do a mapping.
Absolutely.
So obviously the different guidelines like WHO or ISP is obviously some of the things that we typically follow at least. Those are very good to get familiar with as well.
Yeah. Yes. So there were some other questions regarding alarm set points for ultra low temperature freezers. And that's actually, and thank you very much, Dave, for chipping in on the answer. That's exactly that's my view as well, that it depends on what products you're storing. But it's actually another great example of where alarm settings needs to be considered, because for ULT freezers, it's very likely that that's being stored in an environment that's hotter. So the likelihood that it should suddenly drop rapidly in temperature is not as high as it should increase. So in that sense, it makes actually great sense to justify that you only have an upper alarm setting, or that your lower alarm settings. And those justifications for how you chose your alarm settings is something that the auditors will inspect. And they do expect you to have some knowledge of the processes, both the processes and technical implementations that you're dealing with. Yeah. I don't think there's much more questions here. So we just have a small...
Yeah, there's gonna be sent out, I think, here in the chat. There's gonna get an email sent to all of you as well. But you are more than welcome to reach out and schedule a meeting with me if you want to. I can also bring Jakob along on some of them. But yeah, just to discuss, like have a meeting with us in terms of the different regulations and guidelines. If there's anything like specifically that you guys are experiencing at the moment, and just want to have a talk about, in general, temperature compliance, the different regulations, the guidelines. How do we look at automation and digitalization in this as well? That's a big topic for us. Like how can we actually make this a bit more efficient to work around. Again, not making it harder than it needs to be. So yeah, you are more than welcome to booking a call with me, or yeah, and then I'll be more than happy to take a talk with you all.
Yeah, absolutely. But thank you very much, everyone, for some really great questions this time around. These always get better with great questions. But yeah, again, if you have any more questions, don't hesitate to reach out either directly to Mads or follow us on LinkedIn. We are always providing a lot of insights, some of the insights we get from the many great customers we have in terms of where this environment is moving. Also, please do follow us on LinkedIn. We're making a webinar each month, all to do with temperature compliance. So thank you very much, and have a great day.